The rain fell in sheets, blurring the streetlights into watercolor streaks against the grocery store's glass doors. It was the kind of night that drowned the city in a gray hum, a sound Lena found almost comforting. Inside, the fluorescent lights of Valley Grocers were an aggressive, sterile white, buzzing with a loneliness that matched the hour. 2:30 in the morning. The only customers were ghosts and insomniacs. Lena scanned a carton of milk, the beep of the register a tiny punctuation mark in the quiet. Her shift was almost over. She could already feel the satisfying ache in her feet, the promise of her small apartment, and the worn-out armchair that was her only luxury. Then the bell above the door chimed, a tinny, cheerful sound that was entirely out of place. A man walked in, bringing the storm with him. Not just the dampness clinging to the shoulders of his suit, but a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The air grew heavier, colder. The suit was the first thing she noticed. It was charcoal gray, impeccably tailored, the kind of suit that cost more than her car. Water beaded on the fine wool like jewels. He moved with an unnatural economy, his steps silent on the linoleum, his posture a declaration of absolute authority. He moved like the room owed him space. He placed his items on the conveyor belt. A single green apple, polished to a high shine. A case of expensive bottled water. A small, sterile box of bandages. An odd collection for a man who looked like he owned half the city. Lena's fingers moved automatically over the keys of her register. 2157, she said, her voice flat with practiced neutrality. He produced a wallet of black leather and slid out a sleek, metallic credit card. He inserted it into the chip reader. The machine whirred, then beeped angrily. Card error. Lena waited. He didn't flinch, didn't show a flicker of frustration. He simply removed the card and inserted it again. The machine gave the same indignant cry. Declined. He tried a second card. Same result. A normal person would have been embarrassed, flustered. They would have stammered an apology, fumbled for cash. This man did none of those things. He simply stood there, a predator forced into a moment of stillness, his eyes fixed on the small screen as if he could command it to obey through sheer force of will. That's when she made the mistake of looking up, meeting his gaze. His eyes were dark, a shade of brown so deep it was almost black, and they held a terrifying lack of emotion. They weren't angry or annoyed. They were analytical. They assessed her, catalogued her, and dismissed her, all in the space of a single, unnerving second. There was a small, faded scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection in a face that was otherwise carved from cold, unforgiving stone. The silence stretched. The hum of the refrigerators seemed to grow louder. Lena's shift was over in 10 minutes. She wanted to go home. This man, with his expensive suit and his silent menace, was an obstacle, a problem she just wanted solved. With a sigh that was barely audible, she reached under the counter for her own worn wallet. She pulled out a 20 and a couple of ones. Don't worry about it, she said, her voice tight. She kept her eyes on the cash drawer, refusing to look at him again. She punched the keys. The drawer sprang open with a familiar clang, and she fed her own money into it. Just pay it forward or something. She bagged his items, the plastic crinkling in the tense quiet. She pushed the bag toward him. He didn't move to take it. She could feel his stare on her, a physical weight on her skin. Finally, she risked a glance. He was watching her, his head tilted slightly. The analytical look was gone, replaced by something she couldn't name. It was sharp, focused, and deeply unsettling. He wasn't looking at a cashier who had done him a small kindness. He was looking at a puzzle he hadn't expected to find. Without a word, he took the bag. His fingers, long and elegant, brushed against hers for a fraction of a second. His skin was cold. Then he turned and walked out, disappearing back into the rain as silently as he had arrived. Lena let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. It was just a weird customer on a rainy night. Nothing more. She closed out her register, her hands trembling slightly, and tried to forget the unnerving stillness in the man's dark eyes. The next night, The rain had stopped, but a damp chill still clung to the air. Lena locked the employee exit behind her, pulling her thin jacket tighter. The parking lot was a sea of dark asphalt and isolated pools of orange light. A single black car sat near the exit, its engine idling softly. It was a luxury sedan, the kind with tinted windows so dark you couldn't see inside. It didn't belong here, among the dented compacts and beat-up trucks of the store's employees. As she walked toward her own car, a man stepped out from the driver's side of the sedan. He was built like a wall, dressed in a black suit that was functional rather than fashionable. "Lena Roberts?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble. She froze, her hand hovering over the handle of her car door. "Who's asking?" "Mr. Kwan sent me," the man said, as if that explained everything. "He wishes to speak with you. It's a matter of a debt." The name meant nothing to her, but the word debt landed like a stone in her stomach. She thought of the $21.57. This was insane. For $20? But then she remembered the man from the store. The coldness in his eyes, the absolute control. He was not the kind of man who had his cards declined by accident. He was not the kind of man who let a $20 debt go. "I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tell him it was a gift. We're even." The driver's expression didn't change. "That is not for me to decide. Please get in the car." It would be unwise to refuse. The unspoken threat hung in the air between them, more potent than any weapon. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had no choice. She had stumbled into something, a world operating by rules she didn't understand. Her small act of kindness had not been an ending. It had been a beginning. Swallowing the fear that tasted like metal in her mouth, she walked toward the black car. The door held open for her like the entrance to a cage. The car didn't take her to an office building. It wound its way up into the hills overlooking the city, to a district of steel and glass fortresses masquerading as homes. It pulled through a gate and stopped before a house that was all sharp angles and dark windows, a monument to minimalist wealth. The driver led her inside. The interior was vast, cold, and silent. Polished concrete floors, walls of glass revealing the glittering sprawl of the city below. The only furniture was sparse, deliberate, and brutally expensive. Seated in a low-slung leather armchair, holding a glass of amber liquid, was the man from the grocery store, Kwon Jin-woo. Tonight, he was dressed in a simple black silk shirt and dark trousers. The casual attire did nothing to soften his presence. If anything, it made him seem more dangerous, a predator at rest in his own territory. "Miss Roberts," he said. His voice was a low, smooth baritone, devoid of any accent. "Thank you for coming. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact." He gestured to the chair opposite him. Lena sat, her back rigid. "This is about the money," she said, wanting to get it over with. "It was $20. You don't owe me anything." "You are mistaken," he said, setting his glass down on a marble coaster with a soft, definitive click. "In my world, all debts are honored. A debt of any size, left unpaid, creates an imbalance, an untidiness. I do not tolerate untidiness." He watched her, his gaze unwavering. "Your payment was an unexpected variable. People in your position, a cashier working late for minimum wage, do not typically show such generosity. Especially not to a stranger, who could be a threat." "I just wanted to go home," she said honestly. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Perhaps. Or perhaps you have a capacity for decisive action when faced with an obstacle. That is a rare quality." He leaned forward slightly. "I cannot simply give you your money back. That would be an insult. It would imply the transaction was a simple one. It was not." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the sterile room. "I am offering you a position. Think of it as a way to settle this debt between us. You will work for me as my personal assistant." Lena stared at him. "An assistant? I'm a cashier. I don't know anything about being an assistant for whatever it is you do." "You will learn," he said with absolute certainty. "You will be compensated handsomely. You will live here. All your needs will be provided for. In exchange, you will be available to me at all hours. You will do precisely as I say. The debt will be considered settled after 1 year of service. It wasn't a job offer. It was a sentence. He was chaining her to him, using her $20 act of impatience as the lock. And if I say no? She asked, though she already knew the answer. I advised your driver that refusal would be unwise, he said softly. That advice still stands. You have seen my face. You have inserted yourself, however briefly, into my affairs. Leaving you to chance is another untidiness I cannot afford. That was it. The choice had been an illusion. She had been claimed the moment she'd pulled that cash from her wallet. She was trapped. The days that followed were a disorienting blend of luxury and terror. Lena lived in a guest suite larger than her entire apartment, with clothes in the closet that had been purchased for her, all in her exact size. She ate meals prepared by a silent chef, and she was always under surveillance, if not by Jin-woo himself, then by one of his stone-faced men. Her duties were vague. She organized his schedule, which was mostly a series of meetings with men who had the same predatory stillness as him. She answered a phone that rarely rang. Mostly, she was there to be present, a fixture in his life he had decided he required. She learned who he was not through explanation, but through observation. He was the head of the Korean syndicate that controlled the city's port, its nightlife, its secrets. He commanded an empire built on loyalty and fear. She saw the violence simmering just beneath the surface. One afternoon, a lieutenant was brought before him in the main living area. The man, broad and scarred, knelt on the concrete floor, his head bowed. He had failed in some task. Jin-woo didn't raise his voice. He spoke in low, measured tones, dissecting the man's failure with surgical precision. Then he nodded to one of his guards. The lieutenant was taken into another room. Lena didn't hear a gunshot, just a single, muffled thud. A few minutes later, the guards returned, their expressions unchanged. Jin-woo simply picked up his tablet and continued his work as if nothing had happened. Lena felt sick, a cold dread coiling in her stomach. She had to get out. But how? Every door was watched. Every move was tracked. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered into his study. He was out, a rare occurrence. The room was like him, dark wood, leather, and an obsessive sense of order. On his massive desk, among neat stacks of paper, was a single silver picture frame, lying face down. Her curiosity was a reckless impulse. Her hand trembled as she reached out and turned it over. The photograph was of a woman with a vibrant, joyful smile and eyes that crinkled at the corners. She was beautiful, and she was gone. Lena could feel it. This was a memorial. Her name was Mafia. Lena jumped, spinning around. Jin-woo stood in the doorway, watching her. He wasn't angry. His face was a mask of cold emptiness. He walked into the room and stood beside the desk, his gaze fixed on the photograph. She was my fiancée, he said, his voice flat. She believed there was good in me. A foolish belief. He looked from the photo to Lena. My enemies learned of her. They saw her not as a person, but as leverage, a weakness to be exploited. His wound was laid bare in that moment. Not just grief, but a profound, corrosive guilt. I failed to protect her. My world consumed her. It is a lesson I have never forgotten. He reached out and turned the frame face down again, hiding the ghost. The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, dangerous thing. He had shown her a piece of himself he showed to no one. He was telling her, without saying the words, what happened to people who got close to him. It was a warning. The danger he warned of arrived sooner than she could have imagined. A rival faction, the Antonov Bratva, was making a move on his territory. The tension in the penthouse became a constant, suffocating presence. One evening, Jin-woo had a meeting at a high-end restaurant downtown. He insisted she accompany him. They were in a private room when it happened. The quiet chatter of the restaurant was shattered by the sound of gunfire. Jin-woo moved in a blur. Before Lena could even process the noise, he had thrown the heavy table on its side, pulling her down behind it. His body was a shield over hers, the scent of his cologne, cedarwood and smoke, filling her senses. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice a low command right by her ear. His breath was warm against her skin. The world was chaos and noise. Bullets tore through the walls. Men shouted in Russian. Pressed against the floor, with Jinwoo's weight pinning her, Lena felt a strange, terrifying clarity. In the heart of the violence, she wasn't just afraid. She was watching him. He was calm. His hand held a pistol that had appeared from nowhere, his movements fluid and certain. He moved through violence like it was a language he was born speaking. His men outside the room returned fire. The battle was short and brutal. When silence fell, it was more shocking than the noise had been. "It's clear," a voice called from the doorway. Jinwoo moved off her, rising to his feet in one smooth motion. He holstered his weapon and adjusted his cuffs, his composure absolute. He looked down at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "Are you harmed?" he asked. She shook her head, unable to speak. He extended a hand and pulled her to her feet. His grip was firm, steady. For a moment, they just stood there, surrounded by splintered wood and broken glass. He didn't let go of her hand. He held it, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist in a small, almost unconscious gesture. It was the first hint of tenderness she had ever felt from him, small and almost deniable, born from the adrenaline of survival. In that moment, she could have screamed. She could have run. But she didn't. She stood her ground, her hand in his, and made a choice. She looked at the chaos around them, at the lethal man in front of her, and she stayed. The aftermath of the restaurant attack changed everything. The Antnifs had shown their hand, and it was a direct challenge to Jinwoo's authority. The penthouse became a war room. But the threat was no longer abstract. It had a face. And that face was now hers. A few days later, a package arrived at her old apartment building, forwarded by the bewildered superintendent. It was a small plain box. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a single dead sparrow and a photograph. It was of her, taken a week ago, walking from her car into the grocery store for her last shift. On the back, one word was scrawled in red ink: weakness. They knew about her. They had been watching her long before Jinwoo brought her into his world. The cold dread she felt was different this time. It wasn't just fear for herself. It was the chilling realization that her presence was a liability to him, the very thing he'd sworn to avoid after Mnesio. She was his new untidiness. She took the box to his study. She didn't say a word, just placed it on his desk. He opened it, his expression unreadable. He looked at the dead bird, then at the photo. His jaw tightened, a subtle clenching of muscle that was the only sign of his fury. "They will not get the chance to use you," he said. It was a vow. The near loss came during what was supposed to be a neutral meeting, a parley with a mid-level player at a warehouse by the docks. Lena waited in the car, as instructed. The minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. Then, the unmistakable crackle of gunfire. It was an ambush. Jinwoo's men poured out of the warehouse, exchanging fire with figures in the shadows. For a terrifying minute, she couldn't see him. Panic, sharp and acidic, clawed at her throat. She imagined him lying inside, another victim of the world he commanded. The thought was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Then he emerged from the chaos, moving with that lethal grace, a pistol in each hand. He was untouched, a storm of controlled violence. The relief that washed over her was so intense it made her dizzy. In that moment, watching him, she understood a terrible truth. Her safety was no longer her primary concern. His was. That night, something inside her shifted. The line between victim and accomplice began to blur. She thought back over every conversation she'd overheard, every name dropped in passing. There was a detail, something small she'd heard one of Jinwoo's men say about the Antnif's second-in-command, a man named Victor. Something about a regular, secret meeting with an informant from a rival family. A betrayal within a betrayal. She found Jinwoo on the balcony, staring out at the city. She walked up behind him, her heart pounding. Victor Antonov, she said, her voice quiet but clear. He meets with a man from the Moretti family. Every Tuesday night. A bar called the Crimson Door. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. She was no longer just a witness. She was a participant. She had just handed him a man's life. Jin-woo turned slowly, his dark eyes boring into hers. He didn't look surprised. He looked assessing. He searched her face, looking for fear, for regret. He found only resolve. 2 nights later, the news feeds reported a gang-related shooting at a downtown bar. Victor Antonov and a known Moretti enforcer were dead. Jin-woo had acted on her information swiftly and without mercy. He had cut the head off the snake. He found her on that same balcony again. The air was cold, but she didn't feel it. He stood beside her, the silence between them charged and heavy. "You should have run the first chance you had," he said, his voice a low murmur. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the distant, glittering lights. "I told myself staying was about survival," she admitted, the words tasting like truth and surrender. "I was lying to myself." He was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "You are a complication I did not plan for, Lena." It was not a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. It was an admission of her impact, a confession that she had breached the walls he had spent years building. He said her name, Lena, and it sounded different than anyone else had ever said it. It sounded like a claim, like a brand. The Antonovs, crippled and enraged by the loss of Victor, became desperate. Their new target was singular. It wasn't Jin-woo's territory or his shipments. It was her. The attack came when she was most vulnerable. She'd been given permission to visit a bookstore downtown, a small taste of freedom. 2 of Jin-woo's men were with her, discreet but ever-present. As they left the store, a black van screeched to a halt beside them. The side door slid open. It happened so fast. Her guards were taken down with brutal efficiency. A hand clamped over her mouth, an arm of steel wrapped around her waist, dragging her toward the van. She didn't scream. She fought. She slammed her heel back into her attacker's knee, hard. The man grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. Instead of trying to run into the open street, she twisted and lunged for the service alley beside the bookstore, a route she had mentally mapped the moment she'd arrived. A flicker of confidence under pressure she didn't know she possessed. She scrambled over overflowing trash cans, her only thought to create distance, to buy time. She knew Jin-woo would be coming. The thought was not a hope, but a certainty. He would not fail to protect her. Her action changed the outcome. The clean, silent abduction they had planned was now a messy, noisy chase. One of the men caught her at the end of the alley, grabbing her by the arm. She saw the glint of a knife in his other hand. This was it. Then, a black sedan appeared at the mouth of the alley, its engine roaring. The car didn't stop. It accelerated, pinning the man holding her against the brick wall with a sickening crunch. The door flew open and Jin-woo was there. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket, just his white shirt, the sleeves rolled up his forearms. The cold, controlled mask was gone. His face was a canvas of pure, lethal rage. The remaining kidnapper raised his weapon, but Jin-woo was faster. The shot was a single, deafening crack in the narrow alley. The man fell. Silence descended, broken only by their harsh breathing. Jin-woo's eyes, wild and dark, found hers. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides. His hands came up to frame her face, his touch surprisingly gentle, desperate. He scanned her for injuries, his gaze frantic. "Did they hurt you?" he asked, his voice raw. She shook her head, her body trembling with adrenaline. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace that was less about comfort and more about possession. He buried his face in her hair, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. It was an acknowledgement, absolute and undeniable. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands still framing her face. The war was over, but a cost had been paid. His empire was secure, but his greatest vulnerability had been broadcast to all his enemies. She was no longer a secret. She was a known target. And her old life, the one with the worn-out armchair and the quiet hum of the grocery store, was gone forever. She had traded it for this. For him. "They will never touch you again," he said, his voice a low, brutal promise. "You are mine to protect." Later that night, she stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, the city lights a galaxy of fractured stars below. The view was beautiful, a cage gilded in light and shadow. She heard his footsteps on the concrete floor, but she didn't turn. He came to a stop just behind her, his presence a tangible force, a heat that warmed the cold space between them. He didn't touch her, but she felt claimed all the same. She had made her choice in that alley, in the heart of the violence. She had chosen this man, this life. She met his dark, intense reflection in the glass, and a silent, unbreakable understanding passed between them. It was not a promise of happiness. It was an acceptance of a dangerous, inevitable truth. They belonged to each other now, in a world where debts were paid in blood and loyalty was the only currency that mattered.